If we were to go full force into a gold standard tomorrow, most would agree that that would be practically impossible. In fact, it would be quite a long road to make that transition from where we are now, especially considering now that we have topped a national debt of over $31 trillion here in the United States. Nonetheless, it's a long road, and getting there, even on that long road, is going to take quite a bit of work, and it's going to also take quite a bit of faith in our fellow man. We're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about the gold standard and the only way that it could really work as we explore. I'm going to be referencing an article here that talks about this from EuropeanConservative.com. I think it's a great piece. I'm going to insert my opinion as well in there. If you enjoy videos like this, I hope you would consider pressing that thumbs up button as we spin the wheels round and round about gold and silver, and especially gold in this case, because we used to have a bimetallic standard, but most of us would be just happy having a gold standard. And so let's get into this article and let's see exactly what they're talking about and what it is about the gold standard that's so attractive, but also may be very difficult to just implement in the way that the purist would think that it could. The greatest problem with economics is the bridge from theory to reality. Nowhere is it proven with more clarity than in countries that are subjected to socialism. Its economic theory is proven wrong time and time again, with misery in the place of prosperity, and chronic shortages, quality problems, and depressing lack of economic and social progress. If you take it one step further, that's communism. Look at the millions of people who have died under communism. Social economics, or Marxism, is not the only economic theory that fails in the face of reality. Keynesian economics, especially in the politicized contemporary format, is in a large part responsible for the unending fiscal problems and associated with the modern welfare state. See modern monetary theory, by the way, which is not modern. It's not much of a theory, and it's certainly doesn't help with your monetary status. Austrian economics, embraced by conservatives and libertarians, also struggles when put to work. It is fundamentally a sound theory, which emphasizes the intemporal nature of economic decisions and the role of uncertainty plays in shaping those decisions. This theoretical base is a good launch pad for explanations of how government negatively affects the economy. Monetary policy is a case in point. By distorting the money supply, the central bank corrupts the most essential of all intemporal prices, the interest rate. As a result, the private sector decision makers on free markets misallocate resources in both time and space. Austrian economists often promote the gold standard as a remedy for such distortions. In his book Human Action, Ludwig von Mises describes the gold standard as an essential component of Western civilization. It is so powerful, he explains, that it eliminates the need for government regulations on the banking industry. And yeah, it is very powerful, for sure, but when has regulation been totally stripped away from the banking industry? Unfortunately, it is difficult to implement the gold standard. More difficult than the theory may suggest. That does not mean, however, we should dismiss it. But any reform to move a modern fiat currency onto a commodity base will have to be exceptionally carefully executed. I can't stress that enough. It's not going to happen overnight. And so there is an experiment that the author puts out here, Stephen Larson. A quick overview of the gold standard itself is one of the best overviews, as it was penned by British economist Ralph Haltray, titled simply The Gold Standard. It was published in the Economist Journal in December of 1919. He explains, in order to make the gold standard effective, it is ordained that every debt above a certain limit shall be payable if the creditor wishes in gold itself, in the physical metal. The system can only work if the debtor when so required, can readily obtain the necessary quantity of gold. That makes perfect sense, is logical and practical. This, Hawtrey says, is far-reaching consequences for commercial banks. And with the banking system, of course, the banker makes it his business to supply so much gold as his customers require for their daily business, and keeps the stock in hand for that purpose. Technically, this is called full reserve banking. Let that sink in. Full reserve banking. And it makes sense, in contrast with the widespread modern practice of fractional reserve banking, which is what we have now. The latter, which means the banks only keep a small portion of their liabilities and reserves, is often blamed for causing the speculative bubbles in equity markets. Try to go to your local bank and get a large amount of cash out. You may not be able to get it. They may not have it. When fractional reserve banking works as intended, it is smooth and efficient. Joe goes to his bank to borrow $1,000. The bank does not have $1,000 in reserve, so it asks the central bank for a loan of $1,000. The central bank prints the money and lends it to Joe's bank. His bank, in turn, opens a line of credit in his checking account. It's an illustrative example. The relationship between credit expansion and the growth of the fiat money supply is relatively complex. With that in mind, let's see what happens after that $1,000 gets into Jack's checking account. He buys a motorcycle. Joe buys it from Jack and pays with a check for $1,000. Jack deposits the check and buys a computer from Jane using his debit card. Jane, in turn, buys a lifelong subscription to the European Conservative. By now, the same $1,000 worth of reserves, the original cash, and the bank used to fund Joel's credit line, has created $3,000 worth of economic activity. Yeah, and that's debt, folks. That's a debt-based, and that's what the dollar is. The dollar is a debt-based instrument. You see there, it says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. These things are swooshing around the economy, and you're not even printing more money. That's $3,000 worth of economic activity. All that has happened is that the economy uses the same amount of money 3 times. That's what fractional reserve banking is. The practical meaning of this is very important. And so it's possible when commercial banks de facto can create money, that is impossible under the gold standard. As Ralph Hawtrey points out, we can still use paper money under the gold standard, but the supply of cash would be tied strictly to the amount of gold in the central bank's possession, and not a bit more. And so how does this really make itself happen? Well, you would do it on a ratio, a fixed price per ounce of gold. At this point, the gold standard runs into its greatest challenge. To see why, well, there's another experiment. If you use the annual data on the global gold mining from the World Gold Council and the gross domestic product from the United Nations Economic Database, you can apply the global standard globally. Every central bank has a fixed per ounce gold price in its own local currency. This creates a fixed exchange rate system across the entire world, which means that we can use the dollar to gold price as an international proxy. Gold effectively becomes the global currency. And imagine that, because the Bank of International Settlements has already attributed as such in April 2019, putting gold equal to and on par with cash. With a global gold standard, there is no longer a need for investors to keep gold in their portfolios. If the gold standard works as the theory intends for it to do, namely to guarantee price stability, there will be no upward trends in the price of gold. This eliminates the speculative reason for investors to keep gold unless they deliberately wish to disrupt this standard. Furthermore, since inflation is eliminated, private investors no longer need to own gold for inflation hedging purposes. All they have to hold is money, which, thanks to the gold standard, represents the value of gold just as well as the metal itself. This gold would be pointless to have unless I want to use it as money itself in transactions. But why? I could just have a gold-backed note here. But does this not mean that there's no longer any meaningful reason for people to mine gold around the world? No, it doesn't. Central banks are still interested in buying new gold for reasons that the experiment will show to give us the best possible contrast between theory and reality. We go back in time and launch it in 2009, which is a good place to start. We can then monitor the effects over a decade through 2019 and compare it to how the economy actually performed during that time period. Given that the gold standard is worldwide, we can use the whole world's economy as our laboratory. Using the dollar as our denomination in 2009, the entire planet produced a GDP of $62 trillion in that year. All the transactions that take place in this economy are guaranteed by the amount of gold at the price of $1,405.50 per ounce. You use this price because it was the global average price at the end of 2010. For data quality reasons, we do not track the gold price further back in time. And this is their experiment, by the way. At our selected price of 2009, the world central banks would have to have owned 44.1 billion ounces of gold, or 1.7 million tons. They could then print a supply of paper money proportionate to the amount of gold. For simplicity, we assume that the cash to gold ratio is the same as the GDP to gold ratio. This means the total global supply of money is $62 trillion. And the velocity of money is 1 for the monetary nerds out there. Now we have a GDP stack of gold and a supply of money in the economy. We now set time in motion, and suddenly things get a bit complicated. If we look at the UN National Accounts data, in 2010, the global economy grew at 4.5%, adjusted for inflation. This comes out to an extra $2.8 trillion in economic activity. How do we finance this increase? There's not enough money in the economy to bankroll those activities. This is no small problem. We have an extra $2.8 trillion of capital formation, private consumption, paychecks, and other transactions that we need money for. The central banks of the world cannot just print another $2.8 trillion. If they did, the price of money versus gold would increase. In other words, the value of money would decline. The whole point of the gold standard is to strictly limit money supply to a fixed price versus gold. At the same time, if we do nothing, the so-called transaction demand for money will increase. This will push interest rates up. Since the money supply is strictly limited, higher interest rates will reverse the expansion of economic activity. The world's GDP in 2010 will be exactly equal to where it was in 2009. The only way to increase the amount of gold in the world's central bank vaults is for them to buy up all the gold that the miners can extract. In 2010, the world gold's mine produced 2,831 tons of new gold. At the aforementioned dollar per ounce price, this comes out to $127.3 billion worth of new gold. This means that the world economy can now grow, but only by 0.17%. So you're limited by gold mining. And that would be by taking all of that gold, because we know that gold has more purposes than just as money. It is a commodity. It is used for jewelry a lot. But wait, we did not just report that the actual inflation-adjusted growth for the world economy in 2010 was $2.8 trillion. Yep, we did. Which means that growth allowed under the gold standard is just a tiny fraction of what the actual growth was. So in other words, if all the central banks in the world buy up the entire annual production of new gold, the gold standard economy still runs into some serious practical problems. The most pressing among them is a virtual elimination of economic growth, which happens to be something we need more of, not less. A lot of the world's economic expansion benefits poor countries. The African continent has seen a remarkable economic upswing in the past 20 years, in some ways comparable to what Asian tiger economies experienced in the latter half of the 20th century. Billions of people ride the tides of economic growth from abject poverty into relative prosperity. This means better housing and food, higher quality health care, more educational opportunities, and a financial safer future. It means access to more expensive and yet more environmentally friendly technologies, solutions to produce, investments, and competition. Do we really want to deprive the world's poor to a path of prosperity? Clearly, they themselves want it. In 2010, there was demand for 22 times more economic activity than the gold standard would have allowed. 22 times more capital formation, private consumption, government investments, labor income, and entrepreneurial profits. The problem can be sliced in many different ways. should the world's central banks decide that countries can have economic growth and what ones can't by simply allocating the newly mined gold between them? Africa produced more than 1/5 of the world's new gold supply in 2010. Does that mean that they should get more than 1/5 of the world's economic growth? Should only 3 European countries with their own gold mines be allotted economic growth? It's a tricky question, and they are inevitably in a way of any project to rebase any currency from fiat to gold. However, the difficulties in answering them do not suggest that the gold standard is a bad idea, but what it tells us is that any move in the gold standard direction must be guided by pragmatism, not dogmatism. So there's something that gold standard proponents, and myself being one of them, should think about. A limited practical commodity base can improve the solidity of a currency. More than anything, it can help highlight the prominent role in the deficit spending governments play in eroding the value of money. Once a commodity base is in place, those spending happy politicians cannot monetize their deficits without manipulating their currency's gold price. The political barrier that creates may be the most important contribution that the gold standard can make in terms of strengthening our economy and opening a more prosperous future for all of us. So I think that basically what they're saying here is that really the only way for this to work with a growing economy is to reset the fixed price for gold compared to dollars or any other currencies, and each nation will decide that for themselves. In other words, let's say the economic activity grows by 4.5% adjusted for inflation, as the example showed. Well, in this case, we could say that we would increase the rate, the fixed rate for the gold standard. We could fix it up by a little bit to accompany that growth, at least to some degree. Economic growth is good, but at the same time, we can maybe stifling it to some degree, maybe a better thing to do rather than debasing your money supply. So it's a pragmatic approach to give room for economic growth and also for monetary stability. And that's why I believe that even though some of the proponents of moving to this gold standard really would have gold as part of the rules-based monetary system, some are even proposing doing that even within the Federal Reserve System as it is now. That would certainly be a step in the right direction and a pragmatic approach that we could take literally tomorrow if the politicians would be brave enough to do that. There was only one politician that proposed such an activity in 2016 in the presidential campaign, and that was Ted Cruz had made that proposal. But nonetheless, it is what it is. Gold is a beautiful metal, and it is certainly, no matter what happens with the gold standard or not, or any portion of a gold standard that is formed, gold is money, and it has been for thousands of years. And just right now, it's a commodity money, and central banks hold it because they know it has value. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. I'd like to extend a multitude of gratitude to you all for taking the time to watch, and encourage you to please rate, share, comment, and subscribe.